Hey everyone, it's 10 Types, and today I have what I think are the definitive top 10 post-rotation decks. Post-rotation, for those of you who don't know, is Brilliant Stars through Temporal Forces. Well, I mean, it's Brilliant Stars on. Temporal Forces is the first set we're going to get post-rotation, and we will not have... Temporal Forces, when it releases, will release exactly when rotation happens, I believe, or within a very short period of time. Previously, it was the same time. There's weird stuff with IRL play and like PTG live play and some different things, but pretty much they happen at the exact same time. And so I think these are the definitive top 10. Well, I have some honorable mentions, but I think the top 10 are the definitive top 10 best decks. I think and I base this on a lot of data as well. I'd say the order in which I ranked them, I'd say I was very, I mean, it's obviously somewhat subjective. It's my video, but the ordering of the top 10 I think is very subjective and you can kind of rearrange it. And also one thing about the top 10, some of the decks are a little confusing to differentiate between what's a unique deck and what's not. Notably, ancient. Like I just have one ancient deck. I'll tell you that's in the top 10. It's like the ancient box style deck, and it's not the same as Raging Bull. I could see Raging Bull not being on the top 10 or being on the top 10 grouped in with it. In some sense, it can kind of get grouped in. And then Roaring Moon EX is also grouped in with that, as it's kind of sometimes played similarly, and the lines are very blurred. That's true with Future Box as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, I think three honorable mentions. First of which it is Gardevoir. Gardevoir is losing a bunch of pieces. This is just a random list I ripped off online. It's losing a lot of pieces. It's getting some new stuff as well. I don't think it has a really clear direction to go in. Also, the lists that I have in this video are just from tournaments. I think they all won tournaments. Or no, they didn't all win tournaments, but they were just random lists I found. These aren't necessarily the lists that I think are the best. And Gardevoir is definitely the deck that's probably hurt the most with the rotation. That's not actually just rotating flat out. It loses a bunch of attackers and stuff. It's not really a top deck. Post rotation, I mean, you do have Gardevoir EX and Curlia, which are two amazingly good cards, and I definitely think there's some potential. But I don't know. People haven't explored it yet, and it's not a top 10 deck. And I think pretty much everyone would say that. You could also play it with Roaring Moon. That's like a deck, I guess. That deck's pretty bad, though. Next up, we have Marion. This deck's also losing a lot. Well, it's losing one major card, which is Flaffy, which to me is, in my opinion, like a massive loss. I also don't think many people are really putting this in their top 10. I mean, as I said, I think the top 10 is pretty cut and dry. At least for, and like, at least I was looking at Japan and what I think the meta will be like after the Temporal Forces set gets released. And yeah, the set, or this, the rotation hurts because of losing Flaffy. And you do get a few new pieces, but they're not that good. The big thing here, obviously, you have Maridon. You have some other options. You have Iron Hands, and that's a thing, but it's not. Pretty much late game, it's terrible. You're relying on EXP share, and then this heavy baton card. Don't know if you can see my mouse, I kind of forget, but the heavy baton is a card that it's like EXP share kind of, or it's like wishful baton. So it moves the energy off the Pokemon. Specifically, it moves it off of Iron Hands. And aside from that, the deck's not very consistent. It's not very powerful. It's not horribly unpowerful. You do have Regieleki VMAX to boost your damage, and then Miraidon's hitting a decent chunk, so you can be one-shotting stuff. You have Raichu V, but for the most part, the deck's just not very good. It has like no late game, which is kind of important. Or even no mini game. You can power up like one attacker, maybe a second attacker, but almost certainly not a third attacker. Next up, we have Future Box. This is a deck that I like. I think it's kind of fun, but it's pretty bad. It's very similar to Miraidon. In fact, sometimes it overlaps. They both have Iron Hands, and sometimes you can focus both into Iron Hands. But the big issue with this deck, again, it has like no late game. It doesn't have that like engine. You can put engine stuff in, but for the most part, it's really hard to do. Yeah, also the honorable mentions are not really in order. I mean, they're kind of in order. I definitely think Gardevoir is the worst of them. And then I'd probably put Miraidon over Future Box. I'm not sure though. And as I said, they're kind of similar. They can almost overlap. But Future Box kind of relies on Miraidon and Iron Crown, and those are really cool cards. And I think they're actually very good cards. Well, I think Iron Crown's a really good card, and I think Miraidon's decent. But for the most part, the deck has, yeah, as I said, it doesn't really have that late game or mid game, or the early game. Like none of them are super powerful. And if you hit on one, you're probably going to miss in the other. It's just not very consistent, and it's not that good, unfortunately. As of yet, I think potentially in the future it could be good, and I think if people learn to build it better, I mean, it's a brand new deck, so it's going to struggle a little from that, and it's a little complicated as well. It's kind of spread based and toolboxy in a way that's not super straightforward. I don't think it's a completely terrible deck or anything, but I don't think it's a top 10 deck either. And as I said with the other top 10, or the other not top 10 decks, the other honorable mentions, from what I've heard from other people, this is not a top 10 deck. They haven't put it in their top 10. I have seen it occasionally, but also yeah, they haven't necessarily played with it. I played with the little post rotation, but not too much, and it's not top 10. As I said, it has the same issues as Miranda. Moving into number 10, we have Ancient Box. I think Ancient Box, out of the top 10, I think Ancient Box obviously is the worst, and I think it's arguably in a lower tier. This is a single prize deck. It is the single prize. Well, okay, I'd say it's the single prize deck post rotation. It's one of the best ones we've seen in years, but and this includes almost every ancient deck outside of Great Tusk Mill. Great Tusk Mill we'll talk about in a minute, but it revolves around Roaring Moon, the single prizer, Koraidon, the single prizer, and potentially Roaring Moon EX, the obviously multi-prizer, the EX there. You do have Flutter Mane as well, which is like Disruption. It's relatively straightforward. It's kind of like Future Box. Again, can struggle with inconsistency, but you are more focused around playing supporters, so you should have some consistency. It's again not the most consistent, but it's easier to power up. You just need 2 energies on your Pokemon, and you can kind of burst attackers into play. You can't burst an attacker into play in Future Box. I mean, you kind of can. You can burst Iron Leaves because that's what its ability does, and you can use Reboot Pod, which is your one of a spec, but for the most part, Future Box doesn't have that like burst potential. Ancient Box kind of does. Roaring Moon and Koraidon are pretty decent attackers, pretty bulky single prize as well as a single prize focused deck. When I say it's the single prize deck, I mean it's like a regular single prize deck where you just like attack and do damage and like hit for normal stuff. And so it's pretty decent, nothing crazy. You do need to obviously be using ancient stuff. It's built around the Roaring Moon, which needs a lot of ancient Pokemon in the discard. But for the most part, pretty straightforward, pretty decent deck. And I think it's one that I'd highly recommend you play if you're someone who really likes single prize decks. I will probably play this deck some. I'm not a big fan of it, and it can kind of stall out. It doesn't have an engine like we saw with Miraidon and with Future Box. So similar there, but it is better. It is easier to use and more powerful. More powerful for single prizers. Next up, number 9, we have Goldengo, probably with Palkia V-Star. Some of these decks, as I said, can be thought of as multiple decks. You can play Goldengo with Palkia, but you don't have to play it with Palkia. You can play it with Luxray, and that's the thing you can do. I personally am not a big fan of that. When I say Luxray, I'm talking about Luxray from Crown Zenith, which you can play if you start it. Or you can start it, yeah, you can play down like if you start it in the active. I believe that's how it works. There is also Palafin. There's a new Palafin which you can play, and there's like old Palafin, and then there's also Scizor, of course, or just straight Goldengo. I don't know what straight Goldengo is, but that was a deck on Limitless, which I think that played Hisuian and Bastion. So there are different options you can use, and they're all pretty decent, but obviously all built around Goldengo EX to just do massive amounts of damage for 1 energy on a stage 1. You also have Cryptomaniac's Deciphering or something. I don't remember the official translation, or if we know the official translation, but it's a good card because it essentially lets you search for any 2 cards, and then you just use an ability, and then poof. No, I was going to say boom, and then I was going to say poof. I'm kind of tired when recording this, so sorry about that. But yeah, so there you go. You get 2 of any card, or 2 cards, any 2 cards. They don't need to be the same, so you can get those. You can also use Pokestop to get them, but that isn't necessarily the best way. I mean, if it's an energy, you don't get it. But that card's really good. Irida's obviously pretty decent in the deck, and your Prime Catcher, that's fine. I mean, the deck's pretty straightforward, but pretty good. And when I say straightforward, it's not the most straightforward. Certainly less straightforward than a lot of the other decks we've looked at so far, but compared to some of the ones we'll look at down the line, I'd say it's pretty straightforward. I'm not a big fan of Palkia, I'm going to admit that, but I know some people like it in Goldengo. I'm a big fan of Goldengo Scizor. I think that's a really solid deck, but honestly, all that matters is this deck's really solid, pretty consistent. And previously it wasn't particularly consistent, but you do have Buddy Buddy Poffin, which gets you basic Pokemon, gets you set up a little easier and more consistently. In my opinion, it gets your Goldengo set up more consistently. And then you have obviously like Ball Surge and stuff, and it's just pretty good. Next up, number 8, we have Chimpa, probably with Iron Hands, obviously with Excalibur. You can play with Palkia, but that's not very common. I think one thing, a lot of people think Chimpa is not very consistent. One, there are some consistency upgrades post rotation. It's a deck that like pretty much gets better with rotation or with the new set. And then but people complain about the consistency. You don't need to play a lot of text, right? If you cut text, if you cut, for example, this list runs Iron Hands, Canceling Cologne, Flutter Mane, and then yeah, those are like the texts. I mean, I guess it could say counter catches a tech, but that's kind of important. And so if you cut those texts, you could cut Manaphy. I honestly wouldn't think it's that bad to cut Manaphy, but you could. I probably wouldn't, but you could. And then, there are tech cards you can cut, and then you're much more consistent. So, yeah, Chien-Pao can be consistent if you want it to be. It'll lose out on some stuff it would like, but yeah, it's not super inconsistent either. It's a moderately consistent deck, and it does get a little more consistent. You have that Cryptomaniac's Deciphering card coming back, which is, as I said, really good with just drawing cards from the top of your deck. So in this deck, we have the Barrel and Radiant Ninja to do that, and Radiant Ninja is a really important part of this deck. And then I don't know. I mean, it's just really good. You have Prime Catcher, which is pretty decent in the deck as well. That's a pretty logical inclusion, and for the most part, it's good old Chien-Pao with Iron Hands, and yeah, it's pretty good. Next up, we have Great Tusk Mill at number 7. Great Tusk Mill, it's a mill deck. It mills 4. And a few things about this deck. There are some counters to this deck that are played, or they're occasionally played. They're going to be played more, obviously, if the deck becomes better. So you need to keep that in mind. Don't love this deck. If you're like, oh, I love this deck, I want to play this deck so much, there are some hard counters to it. Or yeah, they're counters. You can do some control stuff. I might make a video about control. I actually did make a video talking about controlling Great Tusk, but didn't get into too much detail about the overlap. But you can control your opponent. You do have Mimikyu to like wall off, and then you also have I don't know. You need to play the Ancient Supporters every turn though to mill enough. And there's always the question to mill: is it like fast enough? And Great Tusk might be. You also have pretty good HP. You have 140 HP. And then with Ancient Booster, Ancient Capsule, you're up to 200. With Hero's Keep, you're up to 240, which is a lot. So you could do that. And obviously, that's pretty powerful. I'm trying to think if Hero's Keep is the right A spec. The one other option, well, there are other ones, but I'd say Prime Catcher could be played. Obviously, because it gusts and you can do it when you're not down on like Counter Catcher. And then Hero's Cape can be replaced with Luxurious Cape. But I think Hero's Cape's better. Um, Aside from that, I mean, it just pretty decent mill. It's mill 4 every turn, assuming you're playing that Ancient Supporter, which is pretty good. And I mean, you need energy, but that's pretty easy to come by, especially when one of the supporters you have to be playing uh, accelerates energy. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward, pretty good deck. Again, if you'd like single prizes, you might like this. I personally wouldn't necessarily consider this. This isn't the normal single prize deck, right? It's mill. It's not attacking and dealing damage, but it's pretty good. And yeah, that's it. It's just pretty good. Also, play one copy of Defiance Vest in this deck. Almost certainly, I think that would be good because Defiance Vest is good. Vest, in my opinion, is better than Bravery Charm and Control. They're not the same. I know they're not the same, but Defiance Vest is usually better. Or no, it can be better. It can have higher upside. Bravery Charm can have decent upside as well. There are times when it can win you games, but in my opinion, Defiance Vest always good to have at least one copy of on Mimikyu most notably. Anyway, this isn't a control video. This is a top 10. In number 6, we have Lugia V-Star. Lugia V-Star is back. It has Chinchino. Arguably, this deck should be higher. I originally had it as high as I think like number 3 or something, and then I moved it down some. It's not my favorite deck. I'm not a big Lugia fan, but it's pretty good. The big issue is consistency. You need 2 stage 2s, 2 stage 1, or like 3 stage 1s or something. It's a lot. Obviously, the stage 2s you get into play are Lugia, and you don't play the pre-evolution. You get them in play with the V-Star, but and this deck's a little inconsistent, is what I'm saying. Also, you do lose Professor Burnett. That is a card that's rotating. I'm pretty sure. I'm like 99% sure. I didn't check, but it makes sense that it would be because of the unions. But yeah, they were losing that, so that's fine. You do play Master Ball, and that's a card you probably play in the deck. You don't even have to, but it's fine. And then yeah, I mean Chinchino, It's 70 feet special energy card attached to it, so you accelerate 4, attach 1. You're one-shotting essentially everything. I mean, you're not actually one-shotting everything. You'll be hitting 350, which is not enough to one-shot everything, but it's still a decent amount of damage. I think it'll probably be one-shotting enough things. Yeah, like pretty much everything. I haven't actually seen people push their HP above 350 in decks that I've actually seen people play, but it definitely is possible. Um, yeah, you could like stick a giant cape on, or like a hero cape, sorry, on Charizard, and then you're at 430, things like that. But aside from that, yep, you hit a lot of damage, and you're a single prizer. You're just not very consistent. You are kind of relying on that classic colorless Lugia V-Star attacking early game, and yeah, honestly, that's kind of what you're relying on. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this deck because of the consistency, but it's a good deck. Number 5, Lost Zone Basic Box. You can run a lot of different things. This list does not run a lot of new things. It runs. Oh, I guess it runs a few new cards, but you do have the Buddy Buddy Poffin to search out your comfies, which is decent. I would put a Ditto. There's a Ditto that's pretty good with that. But aside from that, you also have some new attacking options, not in this deck, but you do have. There's a lot of new ancient and future Pokemon, which are pretty good, and you can put them in this deck. Notably, Iron Crown is pretty good. There are some decent options. Aside from that, you have your Prime Catcher, which is okay. It's not amazing, but it is another. It's kind of like Escape Rope. I mean, but you choose. It's much better than Escape Rope, but it does fulfill that purpose of being a switch as well. And you have Emergency Board, which gives you free retreat. Well, no, it's a little more complicated than that, but it'll allow you to retreat your comfies out. And then, yeah, I mean, it's just go to Lost Zone. There are lots of different ways to run it. It's really good. Actually, I'm looking at. I didn't like really look at this list too much before. I kind of hate it. I don't like two waters in Radiant Greninja in a Radiant Greninja based deck because you're never gonna attack with it. And I don't think it's there for Iron Bundle. Iron Bundle you can attack, but it's not very good. I guess you could attach the two waters to Cramorant. You never know. But I think you want three waters. I'd drop a lightning for a water probably or something like that. But aside from that, it's a very good deck, right? It's definitely a top deck. I think it's one that hasn't been explored that much. I'm a big Lost Zone fan as well, a basic box Lost Zone fan. It's been a pretty good deck. It'll continue being a very good deck and having pretty good matchups against a lot of things, but also being a little complicated to play, to build, and all that good stuff. But overall, a really cool deck. And my number 5 deck. Next up, number 4 is actually Arceus V-Star. So one thing I want to say, there are a few builds of Arceus, not just Arceus Giratina, but Arceus Giratina is the main one. You can run Alolan Vulpix V-Star. You can run a wide variety of Pokemon. The big buff, well, there's a few things. One, there's actually a lot of things with this deck. First of all, there's no path to the peak. In some sense, that's good, and in some sense, that's bad. It's good because that means you can actually use your V-Star power, which is very important. Normally you could use it, but you were kind of forced into using it early. Now you can use it pretty much any point during the game, which is incredibly useful to get late game bosses orders or other things. The bad, obviously, is you'd often play Path of the Peak to disrupt your opponent. So now you're not, because it's not in the format. So instead, you can run all sorts of other forms of disruption. I was looking around lists for Arceus, and I really struggled to find one that didn't have disruption. I was looking for one without disruption as, quote, like a normal one. They all played all sorts of weird disruption cards. They played Airy, they played Grabber, they played Pokemon League HQ, which is in this list. They played all sorts of weird things. And like disruption, the deck kind of likes disruption, but you don't necessarily need it, right? You do have Giratina, which is really powerful. And then you also have the brand new Iron Leaves EX. This is a really good card. I mentioned it with Future Box, or I mean, I didn't mention it, but it was played in that. It's and we'll get to it later, but it's really good. You can play it in Lost Zone as well, but it's really good. It swings in, or when you play it, it swings into the active. You can swing into the active, and then you move any amount of energy you want from your other Pokemon to it, which is obviously really useful because then it powers itself up from your like other Pokemon because you can't accelerate to it with Arceus because it's not a Pokemon V. So you can stick a bunch of energies on your Arceuses or your Giratinas or whatever, then play it down, and then boom, send it into the active, and hopefully one-shot a Pokemon that's weak like Charizard. And so the main use here is just to one-shot Charizard, and it's good at that. And it honestly drastically improves that matchup for you. Aside from that, It's pretty straightforward. A couple of capturing aromas, don't really know what's going on there. But aside from that, Archus is a really good deck, still pretty versatile. It has obviously lost some pieces, a decent amount of pieces to rotation, notably VMAXs, so you're not really going to be playing those much post-rotation. You can, but they're not the best. But you do have Giratina V-Star, which is good. You have Alolan Vulpix V-Star, and you have, honestly, a decent chunk of other really good Pokemon. But I think most lists will be running Grass because you do have that option and access to Iron Leaves, which is pretty cool. Next up, on number 3, we have Charizard EX, arguably the best deck post-rotation. Certainly the most played deck. I think a lot of people have put it first, but I think a lot of them just put it first because it's the most played, which doesn't mean it's the best, obviously. And notably, this deck has a few really bad matchups. And then also the Iron Leaves EX is a bit of a counter. It's not necessarily that bad for this deck. I mean, you can kind of fight back. It's not that bad at all, actually, because you can one-shot them back with a Charizard, and you can also one-shot them back with Radiant Charizard. And in other things, there are a lot of things you can one-shot them back with. But also, it's a bit of a pain. Having a counter in the format that's seeing a bunch of plays, never fun. So that's part of what's knocking this deck down, and that's really bad against control, like really, really bad against control. It's not an unwinnable matchup, but it's hard. This list actually runs lower than pre-rotation counts of like Pokemon that can get trapped, but you still have two. You have at least two. You have Manaphy and you have Jirachi. But then you also have Skwovet, which you don't really want getting trapped. Potentially Radiant Charizard. Having to stick 5 energy on that is a lot. That's pretty much all your energy. That will be very bad if you do that. And then Bibarel, that's not really the Pokemon you want to be going in with. And the list also runs very low counts of energy at only 7. And so that can be exploited. Aside from that, you have, I don't know, I mean, you're a really good deck, right? Charizard's tanky, it's very easy to play. It's probably the simplest deck to play in the game that like has very obvious upside, which is the high HP and very decent damage output. I don't know if I'd say it's the easiest, but it's certainly up there. It's one of the easiest and very powerful, as I said. So you have the upside and you're just good. Aside from that, you do have Prime Catcher or the band card that does 50 more cards for 50 more damage. Sorry, to EX maximum belt. There we go, and you can play that. I think that popped up in some other decks, but it's pretty good with Charizard. Aside from that, this list runs Crypto Maniac's Deciphering to get you some more consistency, I guess, although it's not that much of a buff in consistency. And you run Team Evolution as well in the Barrel builds. We can run it with Pidgeot as well, and both are fine. I personally am a fan of the Pidgeot build, especially with no path to shut down Pidgeot. Aside from that, though, pretty straightforward deck, very powerful deck. And running this other weird Charmander that I don't really know. I think it's like some promo, so it's more expensive. Yay. No, it's a pretty straightforward deck, pretty good deck. You can heal your Charizards, that's an option. A lot of decks kind of struggle, but also obviously the issue with Charizard is you're not necessarily hitting the amount of damage you want to be hitting on your first attack. So that's a big thing. Number 2 here, we have Control. I was really considering putting this number 1. I'm a big fan of Control, obviously. Also, there are a few issues I have. I actually played this list, or no, I played a different list, but I've been messing with Control some. It's pretty good post rotation. I mean, it's very good, right? It's number 2. I think the one there's like a weird Control's obviously like a weird deck. I mean, it's just weird on a lot of levels. There's like the tournament aspect. When I talk about decks in my videos, I'm not necessarily talking about them for tournament. Control tends to be worse in tournament, like perform worse because of certain like rulings. But this is not about that. This is about control, like the deck in general, which includes tournament, but obviously most people aren't playing a tournament. So it is good in tournament. Right? It's not like a bad deck, and it performs worse in tournament than non-tournament, but it's still good in tournament play. So it's really good in non-tournament play, which is a big deal. There are some interesting, weird aspects to this deck, though. Obviously, it loses some cards, gains some cards. There's the card that a Mantine, which I would play and control. Aside from that, people also don't necessarily know what they're doing against it. There's a lot of weird stuff. The Mill mashup is super weird. I mean, Control versus Mill is just a really weird matchup. Traditionally, Mill just like wins it, but it is definitely winnable for Control, I'll say. Aside from that, I mean, yeah, you just pretty much boss trap stuff. It's bad against Lost Zone. That's like the big knock. It's not absolutely terrible against Lost Zone. I'll admit that. You do have the Hero Cape card, which does help against Lost Zone, I guess, but they're probably just gonna Lost Vacuum it, so that's not great. A Lost Zone is certainly this deck's biggest weakness, and that's obviously not great. A Lost Zone still being very good, but it's insanely good against Charizard, right? It's like it literally, if you look at play Limitless pre-rotation matchups, which are admittedly a little bit different than post-rotation, but pretty similar, this deck absolutely cooks Charizard. It like destroys it. And so you do, as I said, lose some pieces and some pretty good pieces, but you also get some new good pieces. You get notably Airy, which is a really disruptive supporter card, and then you get some other good cards as well. But honestly, a really fun, in my opinion, a deck. I think it's cooler when it's like not Snorlax. I think Ball Control is much cooler, but I think Control is, I mean, it's very good, and it's certainly a top deck post rotation. Arguably the best, as I said. But in my opinion, number one best, it's Lost on Giratina. Added again, arguably the best deck right now, pre-rotation, and I think it's probably the best deck post-rotation. I originally wasn't putting it up this high, but the more I thought about it, I mean, it's just really good, right? It's not really losing very much, and it's really powerful, and it just kind of like one-shots everything. And the biggest matchup, like the most awkward matchup for it was Charizard. You could use Giratina V-Star, and you could use like Roaring Moon, but that was kind of awkward. But now you have Iron Leaves, so Iron Leaves just means it's really nice. It's really good against Charizard, and it means you're in a much better position. As I said earlier, Charizard isn't really able to get those early knockouts on like two prizes super easily, or at all probably. You might not have any two prizes down. You can go Iron Leaves, take a KO, and then go Giratina V-Star, take a KO, and probably Iron Leaves again because you can just recover it. And they're probably not going to Lost City it. They could, but I don't think so. Did this list? This list doesn't run it. I don't think most lists are running Lost City. Aside from that, Lost on loses some stuff, but it's not a huge deal. I mean, okay, it is. You lose some Switch. This list does not run a lot of Switch. I don't like this list actually with the low counts of Switch. Okay, I don't like Jet Energy. I think some people know that, but it's really good, right? Lost Zones, it's super good. It's kind of broken honestly, but I like Lost Zones, so I'm kind of happy it's on top. Obviously, you have the Sableye, the Cramorant, you have the Giratina, you have the Comfy, you have Radiant Greninja, and then you have the new Iron Leaves, which is really good. So aside from that, you do Prime Catcher. I mentioned that with the other Lost Zone list, and I think Prime Catcher is the best in Lost Zone, and then in Chimpa, it's good in both of those decks. Aside from that, not too much to say. It's just really good. Not changing too much, but it was really arguably the best deck. I mean, I'd say arguably it's the best deck now. It probably is the best deck now. A lot of people, as I said earlier, are thinking Charizard's the best deck. It's the most played, but this deck can definitely beat it. I'd probably favor Giratina Lost Zone because of Iron Leaves. And Iron Leaves is really good against Charizard. It's not like broken against Charizard, not an auto win by any means, but it makes things rough for Charizard, especially. I mean, Charizard is not a very versatile deck. It does have certain options, but you can definitely find yourself running out of energy, to be honest, if you're not careful. But yeah, I'm interested in hearing what you think of my top 10 and my honorable mentions, and if I missed anything. As I said, well, one, there are some different builds of Lost Zone. Two, there are some ancient decks. There's Roaring Moon EX and Raging Bolt EX, which are kind of grouped in with an ancient box deck. Great Tusk Mill is obviously not. Those are two different decks. And Any guard Roy deck isn't particularly good, unfortunately. But overall, yeah, this is my top 10. I feel like, based on data, these were very clearly the top 10 most played decks and performing the best. The only deck I could see out of those three honorable mentions on this list would be Future Box, potentially switching with Ancient Box. But I wouldn't. I feel like that's a big stretch. But for the most part, I think this video is really. I'm enjoying doing YouTube. I'm kind of weirded out. I just published my rank every mechanic that took so much effort and so much energy compared to my regular videos. I spent like a week editing it, and I'm kind of worn out. But I'm ready to get back on the grind. And also, of course, subscribe, like the video, all that good stuff. And I'm going to continue making some more edited content, also not edited content. And I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with my channel in the future. I have some different ideas, and I want to keep improving. But I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'm excited to see you next time.